Welcome to this Vital Health podcast from the ISPOR conference in Glasgow, Scotland. I'm Duane Schulthess, the CEO of Vital Transformation, and I'm extremely pleased to be joined by Malina Müller, the head of health economics at the WifOR Institute. Malina, it's always great to see you. How you been?
Great to see you as well, and I'm fine. What about you?
I'm fine too, well, particularly since I'm hanging out with you. Geez, you're more fun in 5 minutes than most people are in 2 weeks, Malina. So look, obviously what's been going on at ISPOR, the topic du jour, aside from global politics, one of the big things we're hearing is there's a lot of pushback on, just in general, the accelerated approval, which is strange, but there you go. Why do you think accelerated approvals have been such a hot topic this week?
I think it is a very important intersection because it is about how to deal with uncertainty in general. So on the one side, we want faster access and we want kind of equity. And on the other side, we want to be very certain on the outcomes. This is not, let's say, an easy fit, especially when things are going into, let's say, a long-term perspective outcome focused area. So I think this is why it is a hot topic and very debated, and it is also bringing in more uncertainty in an area where certainty is very well appreciated.
And how much of this is just being caused by the general economic climate? There's a lot of economic pressures in Europe broadly. In some countries, 20% of the population is going to be over 80 years old. Mm-hmm. In certain EU countries, particularly the Eastern countries. You know, there's a lot of economic pressure on healthcare. Yeah. Is this just being caused because of the demographic issues and the current economic climate?
No, I think at the moment there are a lot of variables.
A lot of other problems.
Yes. So it's getting in general more and more complex. We have to really consider the aging populations. The pressure on health systems, on budgets, is increasing, and on the other side also innovation is developing towards much more targeted and smaller patient populations. So the question is, how can we still enable fast access while still being, let's say, reasonable with the limited budget that we have?
So a lot of the discussion is around the accelerated conditional approval broadly. There have been some extreme positions, but they have been stated here this week that the accelerated and conditional approval is no longer needed or shouldn't be used. I mean, what's your opinion on this?
There is no black or white. What should be considered is that there are also costs of delayed access. The costs are much broader than a lot of, let's say, stakeholders would acknowledge on their own. So we do not only reduce the direct costs, but we also have indirect costs. We have costs for the patients, but also the caregivers, and in the end, it sums up quite fast. And the question is, okay, how do we want to act, and what do we want to afford, and what are we risking when we are not willing to afford some costs now? I would not say that we should totally step back.
Isn't part of the problem when you look at this as an annuity, essentially making an investment for a return, that a lot of the healthcare systems just don't do that measurement?
Yes.
I know for a fact we were working on a project in B-cell lymphoma, and we were looking at a U.S. hospital versus a European hospital. And in the U.S. hospital, we had over $200,000 in overheads because each of those activities, an ICD code in the health system linked to a payment code, and we could actually add all that up and say, okay, we see $250,000 of costs here for a stem cell transplant. Meanwhile, we looked at Europe and we looked at the country we were at, and it's like, no, our HTA pays us 19,000 euros. We presented this data at EMA, and the response was, well, wait a minute, are you just telling me they're shoving $200,000 on overheads? And it's like, yeah, that's exactly what's happening. How do we deal with the fact that because of the nature of the way health systems are reimbursed here, that there is no need to really measure that sort of activity-based efficiency? How do we get around that?
It starts with a discussion about who is receiving the benefits, what can we afford, what do we want to afford, broadening the perspective also on how we perceive health in general. So this is all interlinked. As soon as there is more awareness about that, doors open, and then you can also discuss, okay, what can we pay for specific, let's say, services, and where should be the limit of such costs? Because I think only then you can capture, let's say, the full impact, and this will definitely differ between, let's say, the health systems that we see. So how is it financed? Not only who is benefiting from it, but also who is paying for it. And when you have, let's say, a social system that is depending on also a social security system where you have statutory health insurance, you will always have other rules than in the markets where it is more privately based. And I think this is just how markets function. And the question is, how does a country want to, let's say, proceed with regard to maximizing the welfare that it has?
But in order to maximize that, we need to measure it. How many of the European governments are willing to do that? It's a cultural issue often. A lot of the practitioners don't want, particularly in Europe, where, dare I say it, a hospital manager is in many ways tied to local politics and is more of a bureaucrat, or even hospitals to put in systems to actually be accountable at that level. How do we get around that political problem? That's a social problem.
There must be some incentives to do it. Because when you know, okay, I will get, let's say, this fixed budget for this service, doesn't matter, let's say, how much time you invest, how much it really costs. Why measure it when you have no, let's say, hope that it will that it will change, even if you could prove that you invest much more time? In Germany, for example, this is highly debated. So how do we deal with those fixed prices? What incentives are we bringing in the system in general? Because when there is, let's say, a fixed amount of hospital nights for a specific surgery, and then the hospital will just, let's say, use it because why not? Yeah,
because money is fungible.
Yes, and but they will also do nothing to speed it up. But maybe people will also be sent home, although they should stay longer.
If we take this back to approvals, and let's look at some of the accelerated approvals again, that's the topic du jour here. What are the differences between the needs at the EMA, the regulatory approval, and what IQWiG would need? Obviously, the effectiveness. How are we dealing with that gap between the two?
Germany is often considered a very strict and very narrow environment for value assessment. Broader societal dimensions are not captured. Endpoints and real-world evidence or artificial data, even meta-analyses are not, let's say, that welcomed. Then looking at how, let's say, important Germany is for some companies, they might do what is needed there, and the other, let's say, countries will follow. And I think harmonizing the HTA systems or regulatories, this is really a huge effort. Is it realistic that it will happen? And to what extent do we want to harmonize? Do we want to make it easier for companies or stakeholders to find this data, more countries benefit of or from, or do we want to keep it much more decentralized?
Germany's always had this philosophy, which many of our clients on the industry side really like. It's okay, we get EMA approval, IQWiG will bring it in, we allow the drug in, and then we'll basically allow a value assessment based on how we used to be a year. Okay, now it's 6 months. Okay, fair enough. But the point is the drug comes in very early, and it is by far the earliest access within any EU country. There's no question.
True.
Now, the Dutch used to do that, but now the Dutch are using a lockbox, which is not necessarily justified by any legislation, but it's like, oh, well, we just have these special cases. Now you're up to 36 drugs in the Netherlands, which you put into this lockbox. So we're actually seeing more and more divergence. Do you think it's realistic to look for convergence? I think we'd want that ideologically and in a perfect world, but we're seeing such divergence economically as well.
This is also what has been discussed in the context of JCA a lot. And last year this was much more prominent also here at ISPOR. And I think you always have to consider the whole economic context. And it is not realistic to assume that we will harmonize all the health systems, the approval processes, and so on. So I would say no, but when we talk about JCA and Europe as a whole, and we want European competitiveness, we want to position us as a strong, let's say, economic force as well, then we should at least work towards minimizing the health inequity we see. Because I have colleagues working and living in Greece. They wait so much longer.
And only 11% of EMA-approved drugs are coming into the market now.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure if this is heavily depending on the exact scope of HTA or the process. I think there is much more that is influencing these things, and this is also related to the economic, let's say, situation countries are in. What is the willingness or ability to pay for something, but also how do they set the priorities? So it is good to talk about those processes, also about standardization, harmonization, but I think the topic is much bigger, and only when we are willing to talk about this and how we can minimize it, then it would make sense to also discuss, okay, how can we now standardize the whole process for everything, and will it really bring the real change?
So we've got all the HTAs now moving into EMA. Is that going to help? I mean, by them being in the same building, is this going to facilitate a quicker alignment?
On an informal basis, it can for sure minimize, let's say, miscommunication. I could imagine that. But from a procedural point of view, I don't think so. Because at the one side, what is happening, let's say, there from a very rigid and also national perspective, and what is allowed and what can happen after an assessment has been made, again, depends really on each of the countries', let's say, willingness, ability to make decisions or finance decisions. I would not overestimate.
Let's look at the evidence side. You've obviously done a lot of work on evaluation of accelerated approvals, alternative endpoints, biomarker-based endpoints, surrogate endpoints for proxies, progression-free survival, et cetera. This is one of the areas that you do a lot of work in. There's a big cry, again, similar to the pushback against from accelerated approvals and conditional approvals. There's a mounting chorus of voices saying that we should be moving away from surrogate endpoints and only looking at overall survival. Do you think that's a good idea? And secondly, what do you think is going to happen if we start implementing an overall survival endpoint as a matter of course?
For some diseases, it is just an endpoint that makes not that much sense, because you have to wait so long or only so short to
depending on the disease.
Depending on the disease. When we wait until such then a clinical trial or a study is finalized, until we reach this endpoint, again, what does it cost us to have then the delay of access or the delay of first having even the evidence? And then also the question is, do we only want to live longer? Is it already enough to have longer progression-free survival, for example? Because for a lot of diseases, it is much more that defines the patient's quality of life. What support do I need? How often do I need to get to appointments at the hospital? So there is much more, and the question is, what do we want to finance? What is the ultimate goal, and what is really, really important for us? Because we are also not, let's say, looking in other disease areas for, let's say, overall survival necessarily. But then maybe the German example comes back again. It is very hard in Germany to really get along the overall survival with a proxy. Innovative manufacturers, they are really desperate, and sure, it is their business, but they are also in the end really improving patients' life and contributing to an overall functioning health system.
But WifOR has also incorporated a lot of metrics around patient-reported outcomes. You've done a lot of work in that area. IQWiG does accept those. How are those being incorporated in then?
It is not often submitted because it takes a lot of time, it is effort. You have to also, for those, let's say, additional things,
not kidding, that's also cost, right?
Yeah, it's cost, and you also have to fulfill a specific, let's say, evidence level. So it is really a lot of work, and the chances that it will be reflected in the decision it's not that, let's say, high.
So if we look at this from the standpoint of the accelerated approval currently, one of the other criticisms we hear a lot from regulators is, okay, we've put it in, it was an accelerated approval, conditional approval, the secondary endpoint we used, turned out it didn't actually progress to overall survival, or wow, we found this huge safety signal here, we've got to pull the drug. Are the mechanisms there now to do that? Because one of the complaints you hear from regulators is it's actually very difficult to put a drug in when you've had this approval and then suddenly, no, we're going to pull it.
Yeah.
Now, 20% do come out. We know that, roughly 18 to 21% depending on the year. But still, there's 80% that don't, and there's a big criticism there. Are those mechanisms in existence now?
No, there are a lot of discussions, and there are maybe theoretically mechanisms, but thinking from a practical point of view, you see then individual patients still benefiting from this medicine, for example.
Yeah,
It will not
maybe
be
not in
put.
the mean, but on the outliers. So, yeah, there are people who are responders. That's
Yes,
correct.
and then there is a big hesitancy to pull it out from, let's say, from hospitals or doctors. And you can, on a theoretical basis, always set up rules. But the question is then always, okay, will people really, let's say, follow them?
Yeah.
And what does it mean we, let's say, pull them out? Is it illegal to buy them? Probably not, yeah? So there will always be a market for that. And the question is, okay, can we maybe then find other ways to still kind of reimburse or pay those medications or drugs? What lies behind, let's say, this hesitancy to get it out of the market, beside maybe the company's willingness to still sell it? So it is indeed really complex, and I can understand that there is also then from the regulatory side the hesitancy to start such approvals, because there is then always the chance that they will have to live in the end with a drug that is not effective enough. When the real world data collection is happening, you see a delay or, let's say, incomplete data generation. So it is really a risk.
You talk about real world evidence, and as you know, our firm does a lot of work with real world evidence. Unfortunately, we have to do a lot of that work in the United States. I mean, I know I have an American accent, but I do live in Belgium. Spent 25 years here. I have a Belgian passport, half Belgian. The reality is we'd like to do more RWE work in Europe, but it's really, really hard. And part of the reason is the GDPR.
Yeah.
Do you see the current data regulation as it stands as tenable, given everything we're talking about? It sounds like we're going to need some sort of real-world evidence package, but that's really difficult to do, and it's not forthcoming. What needs to happen?
In some instances, there is a willingness to change it, but it is really a bureaucratic monster, and I'm not quite sure if this will change super soon, to be honest. It is hard to get data to analyze it, and maybe European Health Data Space and dealing with this might help, but I see this also not in the short term working.
People are saying they want registry data, right?
Yeah.
But the problem is, right now, you don't get registry data. You may get claims data or something like that, but claims data is filtered, and it's a process that's taken from somebody else. It's somebody else's interpretation of the data. Yet hospitals in Germany often have their own data sets and their own EHR systems, yet you can't access them. So how do you folks at WifOR work with real-world evidence? What do you do?
We have worked with registry data. So for us, it is also challenging, and we would love to just have some data. And we are a private research institute, so for us, this means that the hurdle is even higher, or the barrier. So we always have to, even for our internal projects where we are not getting money for, it's a process to have access to such data. So we really rely on then such specific situations where we work with registry data, or we rely on secondary data. And also for the health claims data, it has gotten
much
even
worse.
more complicated. And this is then also really limited and restricted. So depending on what you want to analyze, you will not have access via VPN. You have to be there, and then you have to write a protocol. I think we are losing potential there.
One of the things that's really fascinating to me when we're hearing these discussions around accelerated approval is, well, we need more checkpoints, we need to have more validation. If we start earlier, that's fine. We need some sort of real-world evidence principles. Now, I've been around this business for 15 years in Europe. It strikes me as, boy, this sure sounds a lot like the Adaptive Pathways project that we worked on, way back when. Do you think that adaptive approaches are starting to come back? Is this starting to come in fashion again? Let's say le métier du jour, peut-être? Are we seeing this?
Yeah, it is like a revival somehow, or it feels like that. What might be easier now is that it is clear that you need really the exchange between the different parties, and that this is even more willingness than 10 years ago to really have this exchange. Nevertheless, I think it is still super complex, and I don't know if in 10 years we will be sitting here and we will just discuss the
Still
same
be talking
thing.
about an adaptive license.
But maybe then, maybe then it has again a different name.
One of the challenges we had with Germany is ICWIG was saying, look, we're restricted by legislation to be able to do this. We just can't. And that caused a lot of problems to be able to focus on an implementation. Are those regulatory barriers at the member state level still there? Have they been alleviated? Do they have more flexibility now? What do you think?
They have more flexibility, yes. It always depends on the reference value. There is still some room for more flexibility. Although, really, there have been some submissions. I'm not quite sure how important this is in the overall context, or it will become.
Well, I think if you start throwing out overall survival and saying you can't do a conditional approval, and this is an option, I think by virtue of necessity, this will become important. I mean, you've got to get some sort of approval. If assuming people still want to come to Europe. And this brings us to probably the topic you and I probably spend the next 5 hours on. Let's talk about most favored nations, the elephant in the room. We have the Trump administration proposing most favored nations. We know from work we're doing, we get some net pricing data from the clients. We're looking at these. We're seeing net price about 60-70% differential between Luxembourg and the U.S. on average. We have looked at 37 different oncology products. We see enormous differences across the U.S. and Europe. If we take the lowest price in the basket, we see an 80% reduction in net present value of the current portfolio of oncology products. In other words, 80% of those products are no longer commercially viable and likely would not have come to market had the most favored nation been in place. What is the big challenge here, and what's the big risk for most favored nations from your perspective or your clients?
A delay between access to innovations that is even, let's say, much broader.
Than it is now.
Than it is now. I think so. Or that some countries might not even receive specific medications.
3 years ago, we saw a 6-month delay between FDA and EMA. In the last 4 years, that's now gone to 1.8, 1.9 years. Just FDA to EMA, that's before HTA. Yeah. So these delays are growing. This is before MFN.
Yes. And we see also, for example, in oncology products between FDA and EMA, we already see 230 days or so of delay. And this is then also still projecting into the European countries.
Sure.
As I mentioned, between Germany and Greece, there is a big difference. It is very hard to assess or to really have a look in the future, but I don't think that it will benefit Europe, and that we have to act now. We have to send positive signals for investors, companies, to incentivize them to still come to our market. A really big challenge for markets or companies in general is insecurity or unpredictability, and this is what the US is at the moment signaling or sending. And this will not vanish when Europeans sets a strong or a stronger signal, but maybe it can reduce a little bit the consequences of what is debated at the moment regarding reference drug pricing.
In May, the European Commission did a press release about a new policy that they've put in place where a compulsory license, the ability to confiscate patents in a public health emergency and then basically release them to a competitor of the person who's the patent holder, has now been centralized. So you don't need to go to the 27 different individual member states to do this. They've created the mechanisms to do a one-stop shop. Did they do this because of MFN? Because they're afraid that you're going to see some drugs that have patents that are no longer going to be released?
I would say rather yes.
Yeah. So from a political standpoint, what's the downside for a politician? Okay, we've been complaining the drugs are too expensive. Company's not going to put it in Europe because it's going to kill their U.S. market. Fine, we're just going to compulsory license. Does anyone lose politically in that? I mean, basically, you're not going to see any more innovation. There's no question there. Drug research is going to pull out, but politically, short-term wise, if you're a politician, is there any downside to this?
In the context of health, this is one of the general big problems, that we are focusing on short-term solutions and decisions, and we are not seeing the middle and long-term enough. So we are seeing, for example, also a lot of R&D being done now, or also clinical trials being done in China now, for example. And both US and Europe, we did not take it serious. And I think we should step back and have a look at the whole ecosystem and universe and think of, okay, what do we want as Europe? How can we position ourselves? What is a good, strong signal? And how can we ensure that also bureaucracy is reduced, because this is what I hear all the time, although there are already mechanisms in place to be attractive. Because it's not only about manufacturers and the pipeline that we have here, it is also about scientists, researchers. How can we attract also them? How can we generate an environment that will attract more innovation in general? And I'm not quite sure if this is fully reflected in Europe's decisions always, or in this area of health.
You mentioned China and people didn't expect it, or it was overlooked. I mean, the reality is 2019, China was producing 100 FDA registered trials. It's gone up a full order of magnitude in 4 years. I mean, there's 1,000 registered FDA trials. Dare I say more than European-led companies. I mean, China's now exceeded Europe in the amount of clinical trials they're registering with FDA. And the scary thing is by 2028, by our projection, it exceeds the US too. If you could make one recommendation, given your expertise and knowledge, WifOR has a huge amount of pan-European knowledge, and you folks are really at the coalface. You're doing a lot of very good work. If you could make one tangible recommendation now that could be implemented to try and fix some of these issues, where would you start? What recommendation would you make?
Let's focus on Europe, because this is what is closer. I think the first step should be that we see health in all, let's say, dimension and areas as part of Europe's competitiveness. So we must ensure health, we must ensure everything to be less dependent from other countries. And once this, let's say, has been acknowledged on a specific level, then we should broaden the strategies we already have in the area of pharmaceutical spending in general, or cooperation, and then see, okay, how can we elevate Europe's health together.
Dr. Malina Müller, always a pleasure speaking to you at the WifOR Institute, and it's been great to have you here. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Duane.
Video production by Ben Harbour, editing by Caden Drake. This Vital Health podcast is a production of Vital Transformation LLC, copyright 2025.